Good evening. Our verse for tonight is Romans chapter 8, verses 5 to 9. And I will read. Verse 5. Those who live according to the sinful nature have their mind set on what that nature desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires. The mind of the sinful man is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by the sinful nature cannot please God. Verse 9. You, however, are controlled not by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit, if the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ. When we accepted Jesus into our lives, we were no longer controlled by the sinful nature. We were no longer slaves to sin, meaning we now have a choice whether to sin or not. When we were yet slaves to sin, we had no choice but to follow our sinful nature. That was why we were described as slaves to sin, because slaves do not have a choice but to obey their master. That is also why verse 7 tells us that a mind controlled by the sinful nature cannot obey God. But because of Jesus, we are no longer controlled by sin, but now live according to the Spirit. However, despite having been freed from the bondage of sin, we are not completely free from the influences of sin. Sin will continue to knock at our door, and this will remain to be our struggle because we live in a fallen world. In Romans chapter 7 verse 21, Paul describes his own struggle. He says, "When I want to do good, evil is right there with me." Satan is a way of deceiving us and hiding the truth from us, and many times we do not even see sin lurking its way towards us. It is like COVID. We do not know where the virus is. It may be on the doorknob you're about to turn, from the packaging of the items you bought online, the elevator button you're about to press, and in many other harmless-looking things we use every day. But we all know that the COVID virus is real, just as sin is real and deadly. And we cannot confront sin on our own and expect to be victorious. Therefore, God has given us the solution to resist sin, and that is life through the Spirit. But the problem is, life through the Spirit does not always mean we are living a life always surrendered to its control. We sometimes want our own way. What happens then is that there will remain a part of our life that is vulnerable to the control of the sinful nature. So one would wonder, after having been freed from the bondage of sin, why then would we want to live according to the sinful nature? Why would a slave who has been freed from slavery want to continue living like a slave? How then do we live our life through the Spirit? Paul tells us that our mind is a battlefield. In Romans chapter 7, Paul tells us, "In my inner being I delight in God's law. But there is another law at work in my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin." So what should we do? Verse 5 tells us that we have to decide where to set our minds. Either we set our minds on what the sinful nature desires, or we set our minds on what the Spirit desires. For where we set our minds on, that will be the focus of our lives and the direction that we will follow. So what do we follow? In verse 12, it tells us that because of what Jesus has done for us, we have an obligation to set our minds on what the Spirit desires and to live according to the Spirit. I remember my days when I was still in grade school, ages ago. We used to recite the patriotic oath, the Panatang Makabayan, every morning. As a Filipino, I pledged allegiance to our country, to do my duty as a citizen and to obey its laws. That is our obligation as a Filipino. We imbibe its culture, traditions, and customs. As children of God, verse 12 tells us that we have an obligation to live as God's children, to obey God's commands, to desire what the Spirit desires, and to live according to the Spirit. And I pray that all of us who have been redeemed and saved will set our minds on what the Spirit desires, live our lives fully surrendered to its control. Then we will be truly living our lives through the Spirit. Good night, and God bless us all.